When most people think about ancient Greece, the first thing that will come to mind is either the militaristic Spartans or the philosophers of Athens, or even the great Olympic Games. What is not initially thought of is the fringes of Greek society. If Greek society were a person, then the mainland would be its heart, its islands would be its veins, and its colonies would be its hands. And it is on these hands that we will focus today, because it is only with hands that man can rise after falling. Sicily is by far the largest island in the Mediterranean. Nowadays, it is mostly known as just another part of Italy, but the island has been, for most of history, a meeting place for many Mediterranean cultures. To understand how Sicily played a role in Greek society, we must look at its ancient history before the Greeks. If you look at a map of Sicily, it has three distinctive sides, making it a triangle. Our ancient sources love to mention this fact, which can even be seen in its earliest name, Trinacria, which literally translates into 3 points. The island would later be called Sicily, after one of the three major native groups that inhabited the island. To best understand Greek colonization in Sicily, I think it's best to first understand Sicily before the Greeks' arrival. Starting off with the most ancient group, the Sicani are not as well known as their brethren, but some information is recorded. For one, they claim to be autochthones, which just means sprung from the earth. As this is not literally true, and without detailed records, ancient authors argued amongst themselves whether this group came from Italy, or Iberia, or wherever. With this being said, modern research seems to suggest that they came from Illyria in what is modern-day Croatia. They are such an ancient group that they may have taken part in the Bronze Age collapse in the 12th century BC as part of the Sea Peoples. With that being said, let's move on to the smallest of the three groups. The Elami claim to be related to the Trojans, which fled Troy after the sacking of the city. While this may sound strange and is almost entirely untrue, this story can be found in many distinctly non-Greek societies, such as the founding myth of Rome with Aeneas. While not strictly grounded in facts, this belief is important to note, as it may have created tensions between the colonizing Greeks and the Elami. When they first came to Sicily, the Elami took up a good portion of the western part of the island, and found footholds in two main cities of Eryx and Egesta. The last and most important group is the Siceli, who are best known for being the namesake of the island. They crossed the Strait of Messina from Italy while fleeing a different hostile tribe. As they came over, they pushed the weaker Sicani to the center of the island and settled in the east. The east is the most valuable land in Sicily, as it is home to Mount Etna, which makes the soil around her bountiful to agriculture. The Siceli would continue to gradually push the Sicani more and more west until the Greeks arrived on their coast. It is also important to note that the Phoenicians arrived on the island before the Greeks, and had already made a firm foothold in the west of the island, and cemented an alliance that would remain strong with the Elami. The Phoenicians found success in trading with the natives and used the island as a jumping-off point in their ventures across the Mediterranean. Honestly, I believe that this pre-Greek portion of Sicilian history deserves more attention unto itself, as it was its own dynamic scene that saw people from all over the Mediterranean come and exchange culture and goods. After the Greeks, the island would be owned by Romans, Muslims, Normans, the Aragonese, and the Italians, all of which contributed to the overall culture of the island. I would say that Sicily, more than any other part of the Mediterranean, is a melting pot of culture. With that being said, Greek colonization is a major contributor to Sicily's history. But why did the Greeks even come to Sicily in the first place? To answer this question, we must look at what makes Greek society. Greek colonization started in the 8th century BC, which neatly coincides with the end of the Greek Dark Ages. The Dark Age is characterized by low population growth and low innovation that was caused by the shock of the Bronze Age collapse. As the Greeks started to come out of the Dark Age in the late 9th century BC, the population started to rise drastically. While this shows progress for the Greeks, a new problem arose: overpopulation. Most of Greece is covered by mountains, which makes large portions of the mainland unfriendly for farming. As most people in history tended to be farmers, a lack of arable land will quickly lead to citizens that do not produce anything for the polis. It is well documented that overpopulation was a major problem for the Greek polis, who were frantically searching for a release of the pressure. At this point, Greeks had been trading with other societies in the Mediterranean for a while, and it was from one of these trade outposts that Theocles returned to Greece. On his way back, his ship was blown off course and he landed on Sicily. Theocles recognized the fertility of the soil and the relative weakness of the natives, and he rushed back to Greece. In the polis of Chalcis, he would gather an expedition of around 1,000 men to sail to Sicily and colonize the wild lands. The expedition would found the polis of Naxos in 735 BC on the east side of the island. It was named Naxos because of the considerable portion of Naxians in the expedition. The first colony in Sicily was very successful as it farmed enough food for all of its people and more. This would start the scramble for the West as many polis sponsored colonies in the Greek New World. Colonies would prove to be the release valve for overpopulation that the Greeks were looking for. These colonies would prove to be so successful that they would found their own colonies and could rival even the greatest powers of the old world, such as Athens and Sparta. I don't know if you are, but I am fascinated by every detail of each individual colony, so I'm going to take this time, because it is my video, to give a chronology of the various colonies founded. We have already briefly talked about Naxos, but I'd like to touch on them again for a sense of completion. Founded in 735 BC by Theocles, it is the oldest Greek colony in Sicily. The expedition was made up of multiple Greek cultures, with the most dominant being the Chalcidians and the Naxians from the island of Naxos. As the colony was founded, an argument between these two major groups erupted as to whether the polis of Chalcis or Naxos would be the new colony's metropolis, or mother city. A compromise was settled as the colony would be given the name of the Naxians' home, but Chalcis would be the new polis's metropolis. Syracuse may be the most well-known polis in Sicily, as it thrived until the age of the Roman Republic. The polis was founded in 734 BC by Archaeus of Corinth. Most of the settlers were made up of land-hungry farmers from the town of Tanea, which was within the realm of Corinth. The settlers took probably the most advantageous location in Sicily, as it would be the middle of all Mediterranean trade. This came at the expense of the Siceli, as they were driven out by the invading Greeks. Syracuse would go on to found its own colonies, fight against the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War, and even survived no less than 7 wars against Carthage. It is for a good reason that Syracuse is remembered. The city of Messina was first founded as Zancle in 730 BC by both Cumaean and Chalcidian settlers. It was named Zancle as it was the native word for sickle, which the early settlement resembled. Zancle was founded not for agriculture, as the soil quality was very poor. Rather, it was because of its strategic location next to the Strait of Messina. This would give the polis control over the strait, but it was difficult to sustain a large population due to the lack of arable land. This would be solved in the coming years by the polis founding an outpost at Mylae, which would supply the Zancleans with much needed food. Leontinoi was the first of 2 colonies founded by the Naxians. In 729 BC, the Naxians led by Theocles would expel the native Siceli and found the polis. Despite this, they allowed the Siceli to live nearby instead of driving them out completely. It is also the only colony that was not situated on the coast. It was around 10 kilometers or 6 miles inland, which most definitely cements it as an agriculturally focused polis. Catana was the second of the 2 colonies founded by the Naxians. It was also founded in 729 BC, but Euarchus was given the honor as founder instead of Theocles. It was afforded a good position on the coast for maritime trade, but was also extremely focused on agriculture. Both Leontinoi and Catana were situated on an extremely fertile and valuable stretch of plain, and it is fair to assume that these polis were used by the Naxians to stake claim to the area. The story of Hyblaea and Megara is filled with struggle, as when the expedition arrived on the island in 726 BC, they first founded the polis of Trotilus, but this failed. They would then found the polis of Thapsos, in which the leader of the expedition, named Lamus, died. The rest of the settlers were then guided by the Siceli king, Hyblon. This third settlement would survive, and the surviving settlers would name the polis Megara Hyblean, after both the Siceli king and their origin from Megara in Greece. This concludes what I consider the first wave of Greeks in Sicily. I say first wave because around 50 years later, another group of polis were founded, and 100 years after that one, yet another wave was founded. These Sicilian polis would play a major role in the Peloponnesian War during the Sicilian expedition, which proved that these colonies could go toe-to-toe against the major powers of mainland Greece. One of the best instances that exemplifies the power of the Sicilian polis is during the Sicilian expedition, which pitted Athens against Syracuse. The conflict would start as the small Sicilian polis of Egesta requested support from Athens in their war against both Selinus and Syracuse. The Egestans flaunted their wealth in order to entice the Athenians, and after some debate amongst Athenian generals, a force was mustered of around 6,500 men. They would be tasked with helping out the Egestans, as their apparent wealth would be very useful to Athens. It was only after the expedition sailed to Rhegium that they learned that the Egestans deceived them. They were not really rich, and only showed the Athenians what they wanted to see. This changed the track of the war, as the generals of the expedition decided that the best way to still gain wealth from this venture was to attack Syracuse itself. The Athenians landed on the island and marched south. They would fight a first battle on the field, which ended relatively inconclusively. The Syracusians were able to hold their own, but lost around 260 men compared to the Athenians' 50. Both sides learned something from the battle, as the Syracusians better organized their army, and the Athenians requested more cavalry, which they were sorely lacking. The Syracusians would also appeal to Sparta and Corinth for help in the war, as the Athenian army was much more experienced than their own. After the winter, the Athenians would once again march south, but instead of fighting a battle in the field, a siege was started. The Athenians started building a wall in order to cut off the Syracusians from the rest of Sicily. To counter this, the Syracusians built their own wall to prevent being encircled. This situation reminds me of both the Battle of Dyrrhachium in Caesar's Civil War and the Race to the Sea in the First World War. In all of these situations, defenses were built and manned by the army, who, sometimes while building, had to turn and fight off probing attacks from the other side. Think of this battle as an ancient form of trench warfare. The Syracusians held out for a considerable amount of time before being put on the back foot. At this time, Spartan and Corinthian reinforcements, led by Gylippus, came to assist the Syracusians. Without going into too much detail, the reinforcements were able to give Syracuse the edge that they needed to cast off the Athenians. In the coming months, all of the Athenian expedition would be either killed or sold into slavery. This defeat was a major blow to the Athenians, as they lost more than 12,000 men and over 100 triremes. Who is to say how the Peloponnesian War would have gone if they had not suffered this loss? While Syracuse did not fight this battle alone, they didn't have to. They still proved just how powerful they were. Athens was arguably the most powerful polis in the ancient world, and this would not be lost on the Greeks of the time. The Syracusians changed the war and thus changed Greek society as a whole. They would continue to thrive for 200 years before eventually falling to the Romans. Even after Greece was absorbed into Rome, they would continue to live on within Roman culture. Let me start out by saying that the Greeks not colonizing Sicily would be extremely improbable. They were in immense trouble with their exponentially growing population, and Sicily was an obvious solution with its fertile land and weak natives. With this being said, I think that the best way to show the importance of Greek colonization in Sicily is to speculate what would the world be if it never happened. In short, the world would be forever changed and would be unrecognizable to us today. Let's just say Theocles was never blown off course, and thus never returns to Greece with the news that Sicily was a fertile land. In that world, the problem of overpopulation would become ever more mounting. Polis with a small amount of arable land would fall into civil unrest as the population starved. To avoid this, they would go to war with each other, much like they did in our own world. The difference would be in the extent to which these wars would happen. They would happen for much longer and much more often. Greece's power growth would slow down as the inner turmoil would lead to a slower growing population. The opposite of this can be seen in the Phoenicians, who would eventually control Sicily, and therefore have access to large tracts of arable land and large markets for trade. In their control of the island, they would effectively shut Greece out of the running for control of the West, including Italy. Eventually, when colonization would be attempted by the Greeks, they would most probably found colonies in the Black Sea, North Africa, and the Levant. The pressure of overpopulation would eventually be released because of this, and the Greek population would resume its growth. This would be until the Persians attacked in this alternate history's version of the Greco-Persian Wars. In our timeline, the war was only closely won by the Greeks, but in this world, it would be even more Pyrrhic. Even if they still won, the Greeks would be sufficiently battered. The Peloponnesian War may still have occurred, but without the Athenian defeat in the Sicilian expedition, the outcome of the war may have been an Athenian victory instead of a Spartan one. In our own world, Rome was heavily based off of a Greek foundation. Its early armies were hoplites, its gods were almost identical to the Greeks, and its language was heavily influenced. Rome would go on to conquer the Mediterranean world and form the foundation for Western society. This is because the Greek colonies in Italy, which without Sicily may never have formed. If the Phoenicians were able to colonize Italy for themselves, then Rome would have been based on a completely different society, and Western society would be completely different as we know it today. Sicily is the heart of the Mediterranean, so it is almost fated that in its early history, whoever controls the island controls the future of culture. In our world, Sicilian colonization was a solution to the Greek problem of overpopulation. But it is the long-term ramifications of this that would allow a struggling Greece to get up and pass the torch that is their culture to Rome, who would in turn pass it down to our modern world. A society without hands is doomed to fail. And similar to Atlas in Greek mythology, ancient hands hold the world as we know it today.